This is Frank Islam, Chairman and CEO of FY Investment Group and your host of Washington Calling, where we interview leading voices from business and politics that impact you, the viewer. Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished guest. His name is Sanjoy Hazarika. He's a well-known human rights activist, author of multiple books, and well-known policy expert and advisor for India's Northeast and migration issues. He's an award-winning journalist. He was formerly with the New York Times. Right now, he's International Director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. Welcome to our show, Sanjoy. Good to see you. Thank you very much for coming to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Please tell us who you are in your life journey for our audience. I know you have been a journalist, author, filmmaker, human rights campaigner. How do you balance all of these roles that you play?
You're asking about life balance. It's
Right.
difficult, especially at the time of the pandemic. We have to do what we have to do in the circumstances that we live in as best as we can. And, our time is taken a lot of our time is taken up with issues relating to human rights and issues around that, whether it's media rights, freedom of expression, human defenders, um, custodial violence, issues like that, which are pretty grim. And this is a time when there are lots of restrictions on freedom of movement and assembly because of the pandemic. Yeah? So we do the best we can cross country. We have three offices in India and in London and in Accra in Ghana. So I have to communicate all the time with our teams. Right now, we are rapidly report on 8.7 contemporary forms of slavery, modern day slavery, and human trafficking by the London office. So, and I have to be constantly engaged on those issues. Yeah. So it's difficult.
This will be a good
Sorry.
segue to talk about your current role as International Director of Commonwealth Human Rights. What are the issues that are concerning to you, alarming to you when it comes to India's human rights issue? Do you believe that India respects the human right?
Yeah, I'm sure that India respects human rights. It's a question of not just the government.
I
what
meant
the
to say
government
the
does,
current
because
Indian
India is
government.
big.
I meant to ask you. Yeah, correct.
I think the current Indian government has a very different view of human rights to what many of us understand it to be. And today, for instance, there was a discussion at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, a side event on this very issue. Because I think that there are problems of prejudice and discrimination, which are visible, and I think the government needs to be much more proactive in dealing with these issues and not letting them slide. It can't be seen as siding with one side of the one group or the other, and that is very important to stress, especially if you have a large majority. I mean, this is a problem which came up even, for instance, in the 70s when Indira Gandhi was in power, and she had a huge majority, and she, really roughshod over the opposition. So it's important to be not just tolerant but respectful of other points of view, and we're seeing a great. There are many concerns about that because we see targeted, shall we say, cases against people from different groups.
So they're not. The government is not trying to bring the people together and embrace the diversity of India, which is the global beacon of hope for democracy and secularism around the globe.
Well, I think it is a challenge. It is a
Okay.
challenge for this government, and it could do much more on for instance, mandated in human rights, mandated to protect human rights and be proactive, but they're being very lethargic. They're not pushing these concerns. They're not holding governments to account. Not just one government; it's many governments.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the Center for the Northeast Study and Policy Research, which runs the boat clinic in Assam. These are floating boat clinics, and
Yes.
and tell us what kind of services do you provide? And do you provide free medication to these patients on the boat that come to your clinic?
Yeah. See, this started as an idea, Frank. It started as an idea and born out of an experience. I was traveling, I was making a film on the river, having traveled from Tibet to the Bay of Bengal. I was making a film about a segment of the river, and we were traveling, my director and my crew and I were traveling on, across the Brahmaputra to the biggest river island in the world. A young woman who died in childbirth couldn't get to a hospital in time. She died on that ferry on the journey across. And when we got the story the next day, it was even much more tragic because she'd had a young woman in her teens, difficult pregnancy, carried to the ghat, the overnight in the damp and cold of winter next to this great river. And the next morning, they took the ferry, but it was too late for her. She passed away, and she lost. You had two lives lost, a mother and an unborn child. And to me, it was an unacceptable situation. In my own home state, it's like this, and we pride ourselves on gender equality and the strength of women. So I did a bit of research, and I found that we had the highest maternal mortality ratio in India,
Wow.
493 out of 100,000 deliveries. And today it's less than 200. And, uh, and I did another bit of research, and I found that 10% of the state, that's about 3 million people, live on islands. This is a phenomenon of the Brahmaputra, and there are 2,000 plus islands. So I said that we take the service to people, not people go for the service. That's the key. And health is at the heart of everything. So, but how do you do that? And then in conversations with people who live along the river, we came across, I developed the idea of the boat clinic. We competed for a World Bank award about rural marketplace and connecting needs to services. And I floated the idea of a ship of hope in a valley of flood. It's a catchy title. I know I can give you a dozen catchy titles. You give me a minute. And that's how the story was born. And today we reach 250,000 people, both clinics in 13 districts, and I have 200 plus doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and lab technicians and community workers. Yeah, so it's been.
How do you cope with this clinic under the pandemic, and how do you sustain this project? Who pays for all these things? Beside you talked a little bit about the World Bank, something like that, didn't you?
The World Bank gave enough money to build one boat. That was
Okay.
15 years ago. It was an award. It was just $8,000. So I built a boat, but then what do you do with it after?
Right.
So you scale up. You take a challenge, you scale up, you partner with the district administrations. They'd never heard of a PPP before. So I said, we'll have a private public partnership. I drew up the contracts. But
Okay.
then you can't sustain it if it's ad hoc. National Health Mission
Okay.
of the government of India.
Okay.
So they are funding everything from medicines to salaries to boat repairs. So that's been a sustained and it's gone very well through the state government. That's one. The second is as far as sustainability is concerned, we work with communities. So we inform the district administration this is a plan. You go to the communities, what are your priorities? These are the things that we'd like to do. And in the pandemic, they've been active 24, not 24/7, but they've been very active, going, informing people, checking on issues of quarantine, seeing if there are any communities or individuals affected, because there's been a lot of back migration as a result of the shutdowns and the lockdowns. So they track individuals, they keep them informed, they keep the government informed, and they help the communities deal with this crisis.
Thank you for your service, for the boat clinic service to the humanity. My I also run a clinic in India in a city like Azamgarh where I was born, and I understand the challenges that you're facing. Unfortunately, I'm funding it rather than the government is funding it, but I will have to get some ideas from you. I want to talk a little bit about the significance of the Northeast to the India, the 8 states that comprise it. What are the states that make it up? And I know you wrote a book on Northeast. And
Oh,
what kind of a challenge did they face besides discriminations, post-conflict trauma, and identity crisis?
well, the Northeast is a complex place. I like to call it Asia in miniature, where
Okay,
ethnic groups meet and mingle. We have communities that are connected to Southeast Asia, have migrated there from there hundreds of years ago. There's one group which speaks Mon Khmer, which is Kampuchean. And if you go to my home city of Shillong, you'll see signs which are in the Roman script, but you won't be able to understand what they say because it's actually Khmer, a form of the mountain Khmer that is spoken, hill Khmer. And they moved 1,000 years ago and more. So it's a complicated area with more than 260 ethnic groups. And it's made more complicated by the fact that two-thirds of the communities, a majority of the population lives in the plains. And but two-thirds of the land is controlled by one-third of the population, which is basically tribal, aboriginal
right,
groups. And it was the area where the first shots, the first challenge, armed challenge to the idea of India took place in the 50s by the Nagas, then followed 10 years later or so by the Mizos, then by Manipur, and in Assam especially. And it's been a place where the Indian state has been really tested and has used very draconian laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act to try and control communities which think differently, uh, approach issues differently, uh, view each other differently. And it was not a happy time, you know. We had 20 years of real bad conflict in which thousands of people were killed, many more were displaced at often at gunpoint, and there was a lot of sadness and grief, and people are still dealing with that grief and sadness because there hasn't been an organized way of counseling, you know, like you have people who come back from Iraq and Vietnam and from Nam and from Afghanistan. They go through counseling for PTSS and PTSD.
right.
This doesn't really happen. And people, like when you go and do the filming and we go and interview people and have research, do research, you realize that people talk about things to you, complete strangers, uh, which they haven't told anybody in their family. And it's really very humbling and very moving to find that you have their trust, that five-letter word of trust. And that's what also keeps the boat clinics going. People trust it. If people trust you, you can't let that down. You know, you have to be robust in your defense of them, in your advocacy for them. So, yeah, and right now, the situation is not of largely of conflict. It is the conflict has abated. The issues are still there, but
Right.
most of the armed groups are now in the process of dialogue. However fragile it may be, or these talks may be, they're still at the negotiating table, or at least talking about something. We don't have
Uh,
any breakthrough agreements yet.
well, that's a wonderful, thank you very much. I wanted to talk a little bit about your career, uh, your highlights of your career when you were the reporting for the New York Times. So tell us a little bit about that. And has it been changed since you quit New York Times?
Yeah, my life has completely changed. I'm now a columnist.
Okay.
I can pontificate
Yes.
on my views for the world. I couldn't pontificate when I was writing reporting unless I was doing analysis. So when I was with the New York Times, there were several high points. I mean, my first assignment was into Afghanistan when all the journalists got thrown out, and I had a student passport. In those days, in the Indian passport, you used to write your profession. I was a student. So I used to go there and I spent 2 weeks, reporting on Afghanistan. I mean, I wrote the stories after I came back. You didn't have internet at the time. Then, of course, I covered the war in Sri Lanka and the civil war in Nepal, and the fact that I was there when the monarchy announced that it was creating a multi-party democracy. I had covered that. I went for a weekend and I stayed for 3 weeks. The Bhopal disaster, gas disaster, again, I
Right,
went for a
right.
weekend and stayed for nearly a month. And my own home area, I think I interpreted and reported on the Northeast and the neighborhood as few New York Times reporters had done. Traveling, whether it's the conflict and the migration issues, or the insurgencies, or land and flooding. All these are issues that I covered, and I'm very glad I did it because it gave me an opportunity to uh, see the inner workings of a great newspaper and how much of a priority they used to give to issues which many papers in India would not even look at. You know,
That's a good way to put it. I want to change the subject and talk about, as you know, India touts itself the largest democracy in the world, and it is. But the pillar of democracy and the cornerstone of vibrant as well as vital and healthy democracy is the freedom of press, freedom of expression, respect for human rights. So my question to you, what is your view of the press freedom of in today's India under this government, and what about the killing uh, that occurred to that killed several journalists? So tell us a little bit about your view of this government's view on the freedom of press.
I can't speak for the government because the government can speak for itself. My own view, as far as FOE is concerned and freedom of the media is concerned, I mean, they're interconnected, of course, is that there is still freedom. There's still a lot of freedom, but these are under huge pressure. And the kind of abuse and prejudice and trolling that you see, especially of women journalists, independent journalists, it is not funny at all. And these are by bots and by armies of trolls and all that. And there is a narrative which is driven by pro-government groups, I think, which is actually extremely challenging to the idea of freedom and balance, because uh, freedom also has its own duties and responsibilities, but there needs to be some sort of a balance as to your narrative. But in many of the big news channels, you don't see that balance anymore. You see a complete rewriting of what a media is supposed to be doing. The media is supposed to challenge issues. Media is supposed to question government. You don't supposed to follow everything government says. You can follow, of course, a lot of things, but you don't have to be the trumpeter and the singer of praise and be abusive of others. So I think that the media, many media leaders or people in the media, especially the anchors and so on, have lost that uh, connect to what freedom of expression is all about. And you have a situation where many journalists are facing criminal charges, whether it's criminal defamation. Criminal defamation should be done away with. We don't. Many countries have done away with it, and India has retained it. The journalists who've been in the Northeast, for instance, who've been arrested under National Security Act just because they were critical or nasty towards the chief minister of a particular state. Uh, and it's these slap cases which come, which really demotivate people. So I think freedom of expression is there, freedom of movement, freedom of uh, the media to speak its mind is there, but that space is shrinking. And you can count on the fingers of your hand how many really independent media houses are there, whether it's print, online, or offline, and broadcast. And one of the really worrying things, and I think it is something that's affecting media across the world, is you need a new kind of model, business model, because the pandemic has shown with newspapers are going through the tube. I mean, the global economy it may be tanking, or parts of it may be tanking, and the media industry is tanking certainly. People are being sacked, people are being let go at very short notice. This has
Mhm,
happened in this country and in many other countries.
mhm,
And why just talk about India? For instance, in Pakistan, the publisher is senior, one of the most senior editors, has been in prison for nearly a month, and despite appeals, and for a 20-year-old case relating to property. So similarly, in Bangladesh, the Digital Security Act is used to intimidate, arrest, harass journalists. So it's not just here; it's across the world, across South Asia. Wherever freedom of expression exists, it is under pressure. And we have to do everything, you and I and many others, to make sure that it not just survives, but it is robust and continues to speak its mind to the powerful and speak for the weak.
Uh, Very well said. Obviously, your points are well taken because there are a lot of media organization in India. They get funded by the ad by the government, so the government has a somewhat leverage on them in terms of in terms of not being critical to the current government. So, which is a sort of a shameful, but that's the way it is, and they need to make a and that's the way it is. But we will speak out and speak up and make sure that the freedom of press.
But Taufik, I think the issue is not just one government. It's been the huge revenue that comes from government advertising is something that every government, the Congress played that card. This government is playing its card. Other governments have played the cards, especially at the state level. We don't know what's happening at the state level. At the central level, at the metros, you can make out. And what we have in this country, like in many countries, you have metro media, which is not national media. They represent the metros, you know. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sanjay, for being an advocate for the human rights, freedom of expression, and also what you do. You're making a difference, not only in India but around the globe, for being a spokesperson because you do care about the self-expression, freedom of expressions, and human rights. Thank you very much for coming to our show. This is Frank Islam wishing you a great week. Thank you for watching.